Hey, this is Benjamin Price reporting for Kids First, and today I'll be interviewing Michael McCormick. So let's get started. So, Mr. McCormick, Dark Crystal starts quite a resume. What project have you been most proud of to be a part of, and what puppet are you most happy to have helped create?
Okay, let me give a little prep here. All right. Okay, I came into the industry very late in my life, so I was like, let's say it was 1979, right? So I was like 29 years old, which is ancient in the film business. So I was, had a long line of very young, very talented people sort of nibbling at my heels. So it was an interesting story. Dark Crystal, because it was my first major project, even though I had done some other things. But Dark Crystal used all my talents, and some I'm not sure I've even gained to this day, but I faked it at the time.
Where did your love of puppetry stem from?
Ah, that's a good question, because the first puppet show I saw, I was about 2 years old, 3 years old, and it was in Brooklyn, New York, and I remember it very well. So having a memory as clear as the memory I have of that from the, late to early 3-year-old memory, kind of amazing, but it sort of it was an Italian puppet group that had been stranded in the US because of the Second World War. And they performed regularly on the lawn outside the Brooklyn Zoo.
How did your work in Punch and Judy shows help prepare you for larger scale projects?
Yeah, terrific question. Uh, you have to go back and sort of think, well, I spent like with my son performing on the streets for about 10 years before we were discovered, okay? Which we were. It's like a Hollywood daydream. Uh, we'd finished packing up the show. We only did one show that day because the weather was so foul. I can't even begin to tell you. And this voice said, boy, your puppets sure scared my son. And I said, well, that's sort of part of what they're for. And he said, listen, my name's Roger Miller. Has Jim Henson ever seen your puppets? And I said, no, but is that an introduction? And he said, yeah. So that's how it all started. Believe it or not, 3 weeks later, I was hired onto Dark Crystal in London.
Wow. Um, Quite a story. Going off of that, can you talk? I mean, Jim Henson is a legend. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like working with him?
Yeah, of course, you sort of go in with a degree of intimidation because I had just spent an entire day waiting to talk to him, standing on the set out at ATV Studios. They were filming the last show for Muppets. And that was, if you remember, Miss Piggy as Cleopatra. But it was that show. And I stood there sort of dreading the moment when Jim would have some free time, which turned out to be about 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. And I said, you want to see my puppets? And he said, it flipped through my folio of pictures. And he said, okay, no, I don't want to see puppets. I had this huge box of puppets, which I dragged along with me. And I found out later that he was impressed because I had used professional photographer to shoot the pictures of my puppets. And he thought, you got to like your puppets a lot to do that. So that's what seemed to impress him.
And, what were, sorry. What were the difficulties of designing puppets as detailed as the Skeksis, I believe I'm saying that right, on the Dark Crystal?
That involved, a whole bunch of people. Start at the beginning. Brian Froud designed the Skeksis. Lyle Conway did the sculpts. Actually did the sculpture itself for the heads, different heads. Then those were cast into foam, latex. This is some of the first time any of this stuff was being done. And then animatronic systems were built into those heads by Tad Chanofsky, who was this Polish genius who was working with us. Incredible guy. But he could do more with sort of 18 square inches of desktop. He could have built a small universe. He was that gifted. So, and he built all the eye blinks, the sneering, everything was built by him, unique to each head, because the heads were not symmetrical. That meant the mechanics inside, which were all cable operated, no electronics whatsoever. And because you remember, this is like, 1979, we're talking antique technology. And I mean, some of those puppets had as many as 7 puppeteers operating the skeks.
Wow.
Yeah, it looked like, like this herd of people all connected by these, these wire umbilicuses to the head, and these reactions and stuff that were being done, because they were very complex in terms of what they could do.
Sounds like quite a lengthy process just to get the puppet on screen.
Oh yeah, I mean, I worked flat out for 2 years, and then went with Return of the Jedi, but and that's a very long time to work on any movie.
Yeah.
Because usually you're doing 6 months, 3 months, that type of thing. And here all of a sudden there's 2 years, and they had already been preparing for 7 years before that, which most people don't know. But there was that much work that went into Dark Crystal. It was quite amazing.
Well, speaking of Return of the Jedi, a lot of characters in the Star Wars universe have kind of graduated to fairly large followings over the years. I'm curious, when you were working on Salacious Crumb, did you have any idea of what kind of following that character would attract?
A little inside track story here. I didn't realize till about 3 weeks ago that had happened. I went to the Comic-Con in Pensacola, Florida, and I just sat there and signed my name to stuff for 6 hours. And I had no idea. And they'd been trying to find me for several years, and I'm kind of low profile, so they never did. Well, they did finally find me, but through my son. So there you have it.
What was your favorite memory from your time working on Labyrinth and the Dark Crystal?
My favorite memories. Well, of course, meeting David Bowie and working with him was an absolute treat. And we had shared, the reason I got to know him a little was because he had been in New Mexico before, where I am as we speak. And he had been at a little lake up in the north called Fenton Lake. He'd been there in a little old mining town called Madrid. And for the film, The Man Who Fell to Earth.
Mm.
And so we knew the same territories because I've grown up here. And so we had something to talk about. So it was pretty nice having that kind of a relationship with David.
I imagine he was quite an interesting person to interact with.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I can't say enough. Really, just amazing. Kind of a magical person. I don't know how else to describe it.
What advice would you give to those who are considering pursuing a career in film or puppetry?
Well, that's a big question because it's so dramatically different things. Now so much of puppetry is being accomplished with CGI, and so it's you work from drawings and the animators take over, and the puppeteer is out of luck. But for those people who were lucky enough to get to actually work with puppets, let me say that it's a very rewarding way to spend your life. I mean, I'm surrounded with my guys here, and never lonely. And the idea of the puppet is so fundamental to human psychology that when they took the puppets out of Return of the Jedi and replaced them with computer graphics, do you remember that story? They did that. Mm-hmm. They released it. with a computer, and the stuff failed miserably. So they went back to the puppets because nobody was ready to buy that, these puppets being represented by computer graphics.
Yeah.
It didn't work. It had none of the kind of tangible feeling of the puppets themselves. And Salacious Crumb was just a very simple puppet. He had no sophisticated mechanisms at all. So he was just a simple hand puppet. Yeah, so and that's what I would suggest. There are 2 or 3 universities, UCLA being one of them, USC being another. The University of New Hampshire has a very good, even a PhD program in puppetry. So you can get, some pretty sophisticated training in those places. But the best situation by far would be to find somebody like myself who's spent an awful lot of time focused on puppets and how they work and how people respond to them. And because one way or another, and even in a film, you're doing a little performance. You might as well be, in a little puppet booth in your living room. And it's a magical process, but it's that relationship between, let me see if I can write, the right word would be, from a training point of view, learning as an actor to project the personality that you have designed for that puppet, to push your consciousness into the puppet, and the very essence of what you have come to think of as that puppet and the character, you kind of disappear and reappear in the form of that puppet on the end of your arm. So it's pretty neat from that point of view. There's a kind of a magical process, and I think anybody who's done puppets at all understands that strange space that occurs between the actor performer and the puppet itself. And in my case, I create my puppets, so that's even a closer link than just as an actor being handed one and say, here, shake this in front of the camera. And that's what happened with Salacious, a very good friend of mine, who I got to take my place on the show because I had broken my arm on set. So, and Tim Rose, Tim took over and did an absolutely brilliant job of performing not only Salacious, but also Admiral Akbar. So he's had a terrific Comic-Con career.
So I see you're in some kind of workshop. Can you tell me a little bit about the puppets behind you?
There they are. These are puppets, for the most part, these 3 were for my own Punch and Judy show.
Oh, cool.
And this is, which my son and I still perform. And that gives you an idea. And this, his mouth, I'm not controlling that. It's moving by itself. And he can show surprise and, different things. It can be quite mean looking.
Yeah.
And then it can be quite happy. So it depends on how willing you are to take leaps in terms of, I've never seen anybody, for instance, sculpt a head like this that gives 2 or 3 messages at the same time. And but it seems to be quite effective. So I'm happy with it. And his gibbering mouth, which I have no control over at all. So.
Okay, I have one question. What is your favorite memory of your entire career?
Boy, there you go. I think, after all is said and done, my favorite single memory was when I first met Jim Henson, and then immediately afterward met Brian Froud, of course, who had designed everything for the Dark Crystal. So I'd say it was that evening where both those things happened in the same evening. So it was kind of nutty. It was just much going on. It was genuinely crazy. But I never thought, sort of performing on the streets of Santa Fe one week, and then 3 weeks later, there I was you know, having a beer with Brian Froud, and you know, so it's there's no question about the fact that entertainment business, the movie business, can be sheer magic, and that's what that day was for me.
How did you know you wanted to get involved with puppets as a career?
Yeah, as a career being the key word there. And my son was, this is interesting because it's not done anymore, but he was having a terrible time in school. And I, as an adult, was having a terrible time as an artist in life in general. And my wife was very tolerant. And my son and I started the show, and we immediately, both of us, realized that this was going to be a major part of our lives. And that started really at that moment.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sort of just going to try to transition between each person because I know everyone has at least one question to ask. Lindalee, what are your questions?
So you had the chance to work on the original Dark Crystal. So did you have any opportunity to work on the new Netflix show about like that is on the Dark Crystal?
Yeah, there were very few of us from the first show that worked on the new one, the Netflix show. And that was, I mean, Brian Froud and his wife Wendy and his son, the three of them as a family, were fortunate to be able to do a lot of work on it. And of course, the Creature Shop in LA. And I should think probably did work from New York as well, maybe even from London. But I talked to Brian a couple of weeks before it released. And interesting difference between the two films. And I think you guys, as sort of, you know, budding film critics, should look definitely at both things, maybe even the same afternoon. Look at the original Dark Crystal and then compare it to the new one, because there are vast differences between the two of them. The new one is too clean for my taste.
So I actually have my own puppet that a fan made of me. So do you have like any suggestions on like basic moves to make it more believable?
You're good. I wish we had about 2 days. We could just talk face to face. It's so difficult. You know, you sort of sit in front of a mirror, right?
Yeah.
And you have the puppet and it's talking. Well, don't let it talk to you. Let it talk to a grapefruit. Hold it up and let it talk to the grapefruit. Maybe the grapefruit responds, maybe it's just a grapefruit. But in the meantime, there's a separation that occurs, and you can sort of begin to become your own critic in terms of what you think is working and working really well. But it's difficult, and you sort of have to figure out your own recipe for what really works for you. But I think the degree of magic involved. Have you ever seen? She was wonderful, but you might look her up on Facebook. Lamb Chop, and Sherry Lewis was the puppeteer. Her dad was a very, very well-known magician, but her puppet was called Lamb Chop, and God, Lamb Chop was a sock that looked like a little lamb, and that was it. And because of her personal genius as a performer, that thing on the end of her arm just came to life.
Alrighty. Jack and Ruby, do you have any questions for the guest?
Yes, we do. So we have 6 questions. 3 are for me, 3 are for Jack, so I'll go first. So what made you so interested in puppeteering? What was the source?
Good question. You know, most people who I know that have gotten involved in puppetry are kind of shy, would be the word. But their puppets can be, you know, quite smart. and quite idiotic or quite whatever you want to have them to be. And you don't have to worry. Nobody even knows you're there after a while. So the puppeteer gets to disappear, right? And I think for me, it probably started out that way, that I had, I wanted to have that little quiet place inside myself where nobody bothered me. And that place was taken over by puppets, basically. And then at some point I realized, no, this only works if I get out in front of the audience and I perform something like the Punch and Judy, and I myself emerge as Professor Micmac, you know, in his famous Punch and Judy show featuring his son, Snake Little. And so it was, we became performers and sort of overcame that shyness in ourselves. And so that was very, you know, useful device. But it started out, you know, it was slow to begin with, but it developed over the years until you're just not happy doing anything else.
Yeah, I bet that helped. What do you think the future of puppeteering is?
Right. I think, you know, what I just said about computer graphics taking over from the puppets, like, I think that's the moment we're at right now. And puppets need to re-identify themselves and who they are, as opposed to what a drawn, computer-generated graphic replicant of one of them doesn't work. That's not to say that computer graphic images and the characters, they can work. But when they're already established, as we did with Return of the Jedi, those figures were established, and then they tried to copy them with computer graphics, and that's what didn't work. If they'd started with a whole new group of characters, like the later films, it works better. But that one is a real study, please, for looking at the two Return of the Jedis, the one with the computer replicants of the original puppets, and the way the life and the spontaneity of the puppets just worked so very, very well.
Thank you for answering those questions. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to my brother now.
So, Mike McCormick, what was the hardest puppet that you ever had to puppeteer?
Did I ever had to puppeteer? The hardest one? That's a good question. Because my puppets are quite different than Muppet-style puppets. And of course, the Skeksis and the Dark Crystal were totally different. But this, I just add this. The reason these guys are just heads at the moment is because I had a fire in my studio and many of my puppets were damaged, and I'm in the process of rebuilding them right now. But this, can you see him?
Yes.
Okay. His name is Professor Avery Fowl.
Yeah.
And he takes everything I've got to perform him properly. Just so much happening. I'm very difficult to be spontaneous with him because I have to pull little switches and little things I have to tug on. And so he's really the most difficult guy, technically, to puppeteer. He's quite hard.
So what was your favorite movie that you puppeteered in?
I'm a puppet builder, so the idea of performing in movies themselves, like on Dark Crystal, I probably had maybe 2 minutes of puppeteering in that whole show because I was too busy building puppets. And so that's always the challenge for me, is that, you know, my desire to perform, I didn't care where you perform. So, I mean, performing in London every weekend while I was working on the film, my son and I would perform the Punch and Judy show itself. And we were the only puppeteers in the Muppet Jim Henson company that were performing all the time ourselves. And we weren't performing a Muppet show, we were performing a Punch and Judy show, which is quite a different thing. But I think that answers it. Yeah, so I haven't I haven't actually performed because when I was getting ready to do Salacious Crumb, that's when I broke my arm. And that's the worst thing that can happen to a puppeteer.
That must have been painful.
It was very painful. It was, and was for a year and a half after.
What was your favorite puppet in The Return of the Jedi?
Oh, well, it has to be Salacious Crumb. Yeah, definitely. And that happened because I was what they call master of puppets on that show. And so I had an opportunity to work on almost all those puppets, the jazz size snoodles, you know, with their long nose and, you know, skinny legs. And she, so I had a chance to work on, you know, on not only building those, but, and so time was short. And so I didn't have as much time to work on the puppets as I wanted to because I was trying to keep the other ones. It was a lot of work. Let me just say that it was a lot of work. But the favorite puppet in the films has been Salacious, I think, even more so than Skeksis.
When did you begin to make puppets?
I made my first puppet and performed with it in the 3rd grade.
Oh, cool. Did you play with puppets while you were a kid?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I sort of worked with them all the time. And I had ones that I had made myself, but I had ones that had been given to me. So I had quite a little family of puppets, even to begin with, you know, early on. Yeah. But it's like having your own little family of very small people to work with.
Oh. What is your newest puppet project?
Project that I'm working on now.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I'm forced to work on rebuilding my puppets that were damaged in the fire. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. However, and that's this fellow that I just showed you. I've just written a script for this fellow whose name is Thaddeus Rook. Can you see him? And he's a rather simple, direct puppet. And I'm trying to do a show that gets kids. I'm a funny kind of guy. I'm not interested in you know, teaching anybody anything. All I'm interested in doing is getting them really interested, and then they teach themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm doing with him, is I'm trying to create a character who's interested in everything in the universe. And because he's so interested in these things, he chases and tracks them down through time. So he's a time traveler. So he can be talking to Albert Einstein at one moment and talking to Archimedes in a Greek setting in classic Greece 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So it's, and he can do that now, and boom, all of a sudden he disappears and shows up 3,000 years ago.
Well, thank you so much for letting us talk with you today. This is Benjamin Price reporting for Kids First, signing off. See you next time. Bye.
Yeah. See you all.
Bye.
All right.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Goodbye, guys.